So thank you so much for joining me, Professors Cynthia Eriksson and Alison Wong from Los Angeles. It's my pleasure to spend this time with you as researchers and clinicians in the psychological space, specializing in grief, trauma, and now during this season that we're experiencing with COVID, it's particularly great timing that we have this conversation. So thanks very much from us at Wake Up Narcolepsy. I'd love to dig into a little bit about both of your experience with trauma and grief, and how that might relate to our current situation. So perhaps Dr. Wong, can you kick us off?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. So I'm an assistant professor of marriage and family therapy at Fuller, and my specialty is actually in medical family therapy. So I work with families who are coping with illness, particularly chronic illness. Throughout my time doing therapy and throughout graduate school, my focus has primarily been on cancer and oncology, working with patients and their families through diagnosis, treatment, survivorship, and many families actually through the death and dying process, and continuing with those families through bereavement. So grief and loss is actually a really big part of my work. But recently, I, as a medical family therapist, have turned my attention, and a colleague of mine, Dr. Myung Yoon Hammer, and I recently conducted a study about the impacts of narcolepsy on the family. So I'm really committed to this community, and just have been blown away by the resilience and just how much this community goes through, and the ways that they have really come together as families and the unique challenges that they face. And so I'm really excited to be here. So a lot of my experience is working with families, the unique ways that loss enters our life, and how we move on from that and what that looks like.
Thank you. We're really excited to share your research once that's completed.
Yes,
and we'll make sure that we communicate that to our community. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Cynthia, tell us your story.
Well, like Alison, I teach at Fuller in the graduate school of psychology. I'm an associate professor there and the chair of our Doctor of Psychology program. I'm also a Fuller grad, and when I was going through the program, really identified my heart's interest in trauma. It started with working overseas in international work with orphans in Liberia, and the experience of trauma for families and young people in war contexts. But then it shifted to the experience of being a caregiver and being an aid worker themselves. What does it mean to do aid work? The kind of chronic stress of being in environments that are under threat. And then also I've done research in a variety of settings where there's been natural disaster. So being in California, I have had the opportunity to do research and intervention related to earthquakes and responding to floods and fires. I've been able to teach around disaster. I was in Kobe, Japan after the earthquake many years ago, and then in Haiti after the earthquake there. So have been part of the community of trauma work that has really wanted to understand the response of a community to a disaster. And then in particular, because of my role at Fuller, have had the opportunity to be involved in some of the conversations around how community religious professionals can be a resource to communities after large-scale disasters or tragedies. So that's my experience with trauma, and I just so value the opportunity to be in these conversations and to think about how understanding trauma can be something that can be supportive for people in a variety of situations. And then I would also want to point out the benefit of being the neighbor of Claire Crisp for a number of years, and the opportunity to get to know her family and to get to know Matilda, and understand a little bit from their perspective about what it means to be a family with a member who has narcolepsy. So Matilda as a person with narcolepsy, a child with narcolepsy, and Claire as a caregiver, we've had some great conversations and would love to be able to be part of a conversation that can also be supportive to others.
Thank you. Yes, that was our privilege, our blessing to live opposite. It was always so incredible to me that we actually found ourselves in Los Angeles living opposite an expert in trauma, because there were certainly some traumatic months. But how do you feel, Cynthia, that COVID now, this new season, this unique and unprecedented season of isolation and fear, how do you feel like that compares to some of these other natural disasters that you've worked within?
Yeah, Alice and I were talking about this, and talking about the similarities and differences that we see in the work that we've done, whether that's in disaster work or families with chronic illness, and the unique spaces that is created right now. I think as I reflected on the similarities, the things that are the same, I think understanding the fact that there's a community response. So anytime that there's a disaster, it impacts a whole community, and that's a whole community psychosocially, it's a whole community in terms of infrastructure, how different systems are running, how resources are made available, and the ways that the media pays attention to things. So I think there's another piece of just how we are exposed to different components or different pieces of the disaster. That's a reality for any kind of disaster. If you can think about, other events that you know of, and the ways that the media will show you the most difficult picture, or talk about the most extreme cases. And that's reality, in context, but it's also not all of the reality. So recognizing some of those things. I think another similarity is what we're seeing in the community in terms of people reaching out in really positive ways. Disaster often brings out the best in people, and the ways that people are sharing, the ways that people are contributing, the ways that people in different public spheres are using their influence to try to bring messages of hope and comfort, that those are some commonalities we've seen before. The other thing that I want to say that might feel a little bit provocative, and I'm, is that in any disaster that I've been a part of, there's always the desire to find out who's to blame. So we want to feel in control when really overwhelming things happen. And one of the ways that we try to feel control is to try to understand why it happened. And one of the ways we try to understand why is we want to find out who caused it. And so whether that's, an earthquake in LA and why certain buildings fell down when others didn't, or it's the disaster of Hurricane Katrina and the ways that poor planning created a greater impact on human lives and well-being, or it's the ways that we're trying to figure out how to make sense of things now. So I want to kind of normalize that and give us a framework to understand why we do that, but also want to be careful that we don't do that to an extent that we actually limit our support systems, or we stir up anger and bitterness that's not helpful for ourselves. So that's some similarities. I think some differences that I think we've all probably common sense that we can name is that I don't know if I've ever been involved in a disaster that's literally global. That every single country in our world is needing to make decisions about how to respond, and has its own needs in the context of this. And the fact that it's also invisible and it's chronic. So the extended period of time and not being able to see a beginning and an end in the same way. I mean, we want to understand that, but the threat is, in terms of the virus, is not something that we can see or predict in the same kinds of ways that a tornado, you see it and then it's done, or a hurricane, we see it coming and we can prepare for it and then it finishes and we have to deal with the aftermath. This is a really different kind of experience that, at least in the US, we haven't had this kind of large scale threat of virus for 100 years. So that's something that feels really unusual and really different. And then the other thing that I think is particularly concerning and an issue for us, thinking about how we manage relationally and emotionally, is that one of the best things that we can do to help do our part in managing the crisis is to be alone or be isolated. And one of the best things that is the support piece for dealing with disasters is social support. So to have this kind of tension of this unusual place where isolation is part of the cure, and also one of the things that's challenging. So I know we'll talk a little bit more about that, but I did want to note how unusual that is for this particular kind of disaster.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Alison, do you see any parallels between COVID and the longevity, as Cynthia said, and the kind of fear around not knowing what's going to happen with some of your families that experience chronic illness and uncertainty?
Absolutely. There's this fear and of the unknown, of what it's going to look like. And this idea too of there could be second and third waves of COVID, especially as we wait for a vaccine. And even waiting for a vaccine, kind of waiting for a supposed treatment, if you will, or preventative measure, can also be really scary. It can be re-traumatizing for a lot of people, as we're waiting for these treatments that we don't know if they're going to be reliable. We don't know if they're going to have side effects. We really don't know what that's going to look like and when that's going to come. And so I think that that is a really large parallel to chronic illness, of wanting to move on, wanting to be able to put this behind us, but really not knowing what that looks like, and even if that's possible.
Yeah, there's so many unknowns there. If you were working with a family in this context, what are the kind of things that you would say, drawing on your own experience, and kind of helpful tips that people could take away?
Working with specific families during this time?
Yes. Yeah, I was just thinking that what are the kind of parallels between some of the families you've worked with in the chronic health space and our families with narcolepsy, who have also, a chronic illness, and now this added trauma, if you like, this grief process?
Absolutely. One of the things that I work with my families a lot is, how do we make room for what's going on, even though it is an unwelcome member of the family? We didn't really have a choice. So how do we make a seat at the table for this event, for this chronic illness, without letting it bombard the entire dinner table conversation? So we need to make space for it. It's a new member of the family. It has its own needs. It has its own wants. We have to respect that, but how can we do that without letting it take over the entire family? And so really talking to families about making a space for it. What does that look like? How can we accommodate it, whether it's through isolation? We can't go to certain places. We can't really get away from it, but how can we still find ways to find pleasure and joy in what we're doing individually or as a family? But really it's that unknown that really takes over and can be really discouraging. And so it's important to remember the things that you do have, the strengths that you have as a family. And then also leaving a space for grief and loss, leaving a space for the things that are no longer, or the spaces to acknowledge the fact that this is really hard and this is really sad. And there's a lot of things that I thought I was going to be able to do that I can't do right now. Let's give a space for it. Let's talk about it. And then figure out if there's ways that we can enjoy some of those things in other alternative ways, create new normals and new rhythms, but really keeping the illness or keeping the event, keeping the trauma in its place.
Are there certain unique situations in this period of isolation? Because here we are with our families 24 hours a day. And as you say, it's right to make space for the grief and have those conversations. But it's also quite hard, isn't it, to just never have any privacy, to kind of process things as individuals when we're also concerned about our families. What would you say to that?
What I would really want to do is work with families. Every family is so unique and individual. So some families, each person in the family has their own bedroom. In some families, they don't, and they're sharing rooms. Even just something as simple as your physical space. But then also there's family dynamics, there's cultural aspects. Some families lean more together and are expected to come together and not take alone time depending on their cultural background. So depending on your unique family and the unique family circumstances and the systems that you're embedded in, trying to find ways to communicate each individual's needs to one another. So if that's personal space to be able to process, how can we create that for you? Even if it's, for me and my husband, for example, we are not used to being together all the time, and we have a 2-year-old. And even though there's this idea of we should parent together, we should get through this together, the only reason why you should be going into another room by yourself is if you have something that you have to do for work or whatnot. One thing that we've done is started to carve out space that each of us gets alone time. So can you get away for an hour and you do whatever it is that you need to do? If it's read, if it's rest, if it's pray, if it's process, if it's meditate. And I will do my best to hold down the fort. And so even though it may feel like he's being selfish or he feels guilty about that, we have agreed to provide that space for him. And then the next hour, I get an hour. So we switch. And that doesn't necessarily work for every family, but are there ways that we can communicate our needs to one another, work together to provide that space, whatever it might look like, and help one another decrease the guilt, decrease any shame that might be associated with that, and what it means to take care of yourself during this time, because it can't really look the same way that it looked before this. We have to get creative and really work on getting time for ourselves to recharge without those feelings of guilt, if at all possible. I think it's hard for those feelings of guilt to go away completely.
I think also kind of taking from what Alison is sharing too is also the reminder that simple breaks can be 5 minutes.
Yeah.
You know, that we don't necessarily always need a full hour or to carve out, you know, extended periods of time, but that it can be helpful to just make sure that you're, you know, standing up and walking around once an hour, and kind of attending to your physical well-being, your physical body. And in that reflection around what each family member needs, I think one of the things that can be so helpful is just, first of all, spending some time being really thoughtful about what you need, and also allowing that to be different in this particular season, and giving yourself the flexibility to try some new things. You know, maybe you haven't been a journaler before, but maybe this would be a time to find privacy by writing things down, or, you know, just, I think this piece of, there's so much information going on right now. There's so much information available about ways to cope and good practices, but ultimately it's how do we start practicing, and then take experiments and see what's working for our family, or see what's working for us, and then adjust as needed in that space.
Yeah, and it's not about just taking things on as well. It's also about pulling back. As Cynthia was saying, there's so much news, there's so much media. I think a lot of people are escaping into social media and they find themselves just scrolling on their phones, and all of a sudden all this time passes and they don't know where it went, but they notice that they're more anxious or they're feeling more depressed. Finding ways that we can pull back from some of those things as well, so that we can provide ourselves time to do some thinking and figure out what it is that we truly need.
So one of the things that Alison said reminds me that one key thing that I want people to really hear is related to what Alison just said about pulling back from media. Because ever since the bombing of the federal building in Oklahoma City, we have known by research that watching media coverage of traumatic events is actually trauma exposure itself.
Mm.
So when we spend a lot of time taking in images and watching TV and seeing pictures of people in desperate situations, that is adding to our level of trauma. And we need to be informed, and I think it's important for people to not necessarily be in complete denial about things going on, but I think kind of being sensitive to the fact that we are exposing ourselves to traumatic material and having a certain dose that we're giving ourselves each day instead of being overwhelmed by it.
Is that more relevant, Cynthia, if it's visual? Because I know in our house, some people prefer listening to the radio because, you know, you really want to find out what's going on and have a global perspective. But on the other hand, there's members who don't want to watch TV because, you know, last week we saw the mass graves in New York and that was, you know, shocking, as you say, traumatic. So is there a difference between the visual and the audio kind of?
Yeah, I think that anytime that you're bringing in details that are details that you can develop an image of or have personal connection, that's going to have more impact. But I think you're right. Seeing shocking images that are going to sort of remain in your consciousness is part of that.
With that in mind, and thinking about people with narcolepsy who obviously it's a sleep disorder and have incredible challenges with sleepiness during the day, but also disturbed nighttime sleeping, are there any particular tips you can advise us to take up during this time that will help at least alleviate some of the added stress around sleep?
Well, I'll respond to that as I think that is a complicated question. And I feel somewhat cautious because I don't necessarily know the scientific data around narcolepsy and how trauma particularly connects to those sleep disorders. But trauma as a diagnosis is definitely related to sleep problems. Because of the heightened sort of arousal and the ways that stress can impact our cortisol levels and that disrupts our sleep patterns. So I think recognizing sleep, just general sleep challenges for trauma, and then the reality of nightmares and bad dreams that can be part of it is very, very real. So what is typical for trauma response related to sleep is practicing sleep hygiene and doing everything that you can to keep a rhythm, so maintaining the rhythm of your sleep and wake as consistent as possible, to do the things that you can do to relax during the day, to bring your nervous system back to a place of calm during the day. So all the ways that you find to do that, whether that's taking a walk or being in beauty or listening to music or those things to kind of calm during the day to help maintain that. And then with nightmares, I mean, I think sometimes if people are in a position where they feel an extreme amount of threat or they do feel their life threatened and develop nightmares, having the chance to talk about them, talking about the things that are disturbing with a loved one who you're close to that you trust, or with a therapist, so that your mind and your heart can process those things that are going on in a way that allows more freedom for your nighttime sleep. So those are just some thoughts about sleep in particular, but it is really complicated. I think that the stress and anxiety of the COVID situation is impacting many people's sleep, with even descriptions of vivid dreams happening because of a limited sort of stimulation of other environments. Yeah.
That's helpful. Now, we did start to talk a little bit about isolation, which is a really interesting point here because as you said, Cynthia, during trauma and grief and exposure to these massive life events, you know, it is community that, generally speaking, pull us through. What are your thoughts around the impact of isolation more long-term on individuals during this time?
Absolutely. I think it's really important to note that feelings of isolation could be experienced by an individual who is physically and literally alone. But that you can also feel isolation if you have a whole family and a community within your own house. And so it's really important to understand that isolation can be felt in a lot of different ways. And a lot of that isolation can be impacted by our own individual unique experience of how we're experiencing COVID. So for many, there's financial difficulties. For many, people are still working on the front lines. For Asian Americans, there's been some hate expressed, and that's been really challenging to feel isolated within a community. A lot of challenges. A lot of parents are now being asked to be teachers and asked to do these other roles that they're not used to. And so there's a lot of different ways that COVID can really be making people feel alone. And so it's interesting because there's been some interviews done with astronauts and with military professionals whose job is to be isolated and alone. And some of the advice that they had was to really find a sense of purpose if possible. And so day to day, just remembering that even though we are on our own and that we feel isolated, we are isolating and social distancing for a greater purpose, to reduce loss of life, to stop spreading the illness. That if we can reconnect to this purpose and the larger reason why we're all doing this together, then we start to feel less isolated and feel that we're actually in unity with others, that we're alone together, if you will. I know Cynthia will talk about this as well, but the importance of keeping a rhythm and staying busy as much as possible, even getting up and getting dressed. Even if you change from your night sweatpants into your daytime more comfy clothes, Mr. Rogers knew what he was talking about by changing his clothes when he got home. It's just these rhythms and these rituals. I talk a lot to the families I work with about the importance of rituals, not just rhythms and routines, but actually injecting meaning into these routines, whether it's you're working from home and as you leave, whatever your workspace is, really leaving everything there as much as possible so that you can leave work as much as possible. So it's these types of things that can really help us to feel more engaged in our world, to feel like we're not alone, that we can find a new normal and replicate our old rhythms as much as possible. The simple act of showering and just feeling refreshed can help you feel anew. And feeling these ways can help with those feelings of isolation. And keep talking to others as much as possible. We are inundated with Zoom and with Google Hangouts and FaceTime and social media and all these ways that we're connecting. But really, are they meaningful connections? So finding others that we feel like we can talk to, that understand us. I know it's been really hard for grandparents to connect with their grandchildren, and they're in isolation. So finding ways that they can be connected. I have heard from many of my clients, some of whom are grandparents, ask their children to turn on the computer or turn on the phone just so they can watch their grandchild play. They don't have to necessarily be talking to them and entertaining them, but they're just an additional set of eyes to provide some supervision, or just to be there in the daily rhythms, to feel like you're in the same house and you're not alone. Terry Hargrave, who is a faculty at Fuller, and his wife Sharon, who is at the Boone Center for the Family at Pepperdine University, recently came out with a YouTube video, and they have some great tips for feeling safe in an unsafe world. And one of those that I really grabbed onto was the idea of connecting to those that are in your house, being fully present. So for example, if my son is playing and I am present with him physically, but I'm on my phone, I'm not fully present. And I can't expect that from myself the entire day. But in the times where I want to be present, what does it look like to be present? What does it look like to be connecting with full attention? And as I was sharing this with Cynthia the other day, she told me about a poem written by Mary Oliver that says, "Attention is the beginning of devotion." right? And what does it look like to be fully present and to fully attend in the times that we are capable of doing that? And these are just some of the ways that we can combat isolation. I know that your question was about isolation in the long term, but I think a lot of the work that we can be doing in the present can really help ward off some of those long-term effects. And one of those is making plans. We talked about uncertainty and how it feels like this may be never ending, but what does it look like to make plans for when this is over? What restaurant am I really looking forward to eating at? When this is over, where might we like to travel and what could that look like? That it's okay to make those plans, and in making those plans, it can really foster a sense of hope.
We had that conversation yesterday. One of my kids said In-N-Out burger. Which was an interesting comment, because we're trying to do more of a vegan diet, but I really appreciate that, Alison. That's so helpful. Cynthia, have you got anything to add to that? Because it's such a rich area that I think we can draw so much relevant meaning from.
Yeah, I think as Alison was sharing, thinking particularly about isolation, but I think we're also talking about just the broader, what does it mean to cope day to day? And in this particular season, in these particular spaces. And I'm struck by the ways that we're creating sort of an understanding of the key rhythms of the day. Yeah, and I think that, one of the things I've heard anecdotally and I've experienced myself is just the sense of time being this strange sort of twilight zone type of thing, that I can go through a day and think, no, when did I go shopping? And it feels like it's 3 days ago, but it was actually that same day, in the morning. And so just this loss of sense of time, and the ways that relates to people who have been through trauma is Bessel van der Kolk, a very well-known trauma researcher, talks about the importance of predictability, and that building in some predictable things into our day can help bring a sense of structure, can help bring a sense of comfort. How kids really need to know what to expect and really thrive on that kind of predictability. So the importance of that kind of rhythm and that structure for all of us, and going back to that moment. And then I think the other thing that I'd really want to affirm, as you're affirming the ways that some of what families with narcolepsy have already developed as really important and practical coping skills, that those are strengths, and those are strengths that they bring into this season that other families might not have developed to the same extent or practiced to the same extent. And the other strength that I've seen in your family and in posts on the Wake Up Narcolepsy Instagram are the importance of meaning and appreciating the present, of finding the joy in the beautiful flower that's outside when you wake up, or recognizing what you're grateful for, and holding on to that, and being able to stay in the appreciation of that present. That is a real gift. That's a practice that many people who haven't needed to kind of confront some big picture challenges in their lives don't have the practice of that. And are now in this space of trying to learn that through beginning to practice mindfulness, or, beginning to practice a gratitude journal or something like that. And those are really great skills and really important coping strategies. And I think I've seen day-to-day practice of that in the people with narcolepsy who've been posting, and the way they reflect on how they go on with the day when they wake up.
Right. And it's an interesting challenge, that, because as we reflect on gratitude as a practice, I think is what you're saying, meaning it needs to be practiced, because it's not necessarily natural, is it, to us to kind of feel grateful, especially in these times. But certainly just to be able to draw on even the most simple things that we're appreciative, as you say, it might be a flower or bird song, or just something really everyday and mundane, but is still sort of a wonderful thing that we can bring into our lives, and to recognize that that's something to be grateful for. This is so helpful to me personally, and I hope to our audience and to families with narcolepsy as they navigate this season. There's one piece that I would love to be able to capture, and that's helping people be reflective on their feelings. We all have a whole lot of feelings with everything that's going on. There's this mix of uncertainty and boredom and fear and enjoyment, of time with family. There's so many pieces of this. And it's also really tempting to either not feel things that are hard or to judge ourselves for things that we're feeling. And there's a concept called emotion regulation that is really important in coping with long-term stress, with trauma, with the kind of situations that we're in where there is that uncertainty. And that is related to not like squashing down our feelings. So regulation, not meaning like, oh, there's a feeling, gotta like put it to the side and not feel it anymore. But instead is actually to like look at it and say, oh, wow, yeah, I'm feeling really sad today. What's going on with the sadness? What brought that up? Is it, oh, I saw this magazine article about Italy and I was supposed to go to Italy in May, and my husband and I were looking forward to our trip for a year to go to Italy in May, and that's not happening. And so kind of recognizing those pieces, or it may be anger. It may be that you're in a situation you start feeling incredibly frustrated at your child or incredibly frustrated at your spouse. And that if we're not stopping and thinking about and reflecting on what am I feeling, what's going on, what can I do, we might end up acting out in ways that we don't want to. We might yell at our kids more than we want to. I mean that's a reality. But we might end up in situations where we're hurting each other when we don't really want to. And it's because of all of the stress that's going on, and all the things that are adding up. And we really want to encourage people to pay attention to what they're feeling. And that might mean some added time, alone time to reflect or to journal, or, it might mean taking time outs, if you're in an argument and things are getting heated, to say like, let's take a time out and kind of regroup for a second and come back when we're feeling a little bit more patient, or we've kind of taken some deep breaths. And I think Alice and I also really wanted to both notice and identify that in families where there is a lot of conflict, that situations like this can really increase it. And so if your family has a history of arguments that can get physical, or has a history of really struggling together, that this might be the time to reach out and get some support through teletherapy kinds of services that might be available in your area, or reaching out to a religious professional that you trust, or a friend to just support you guys, to recognize that we all need to pay attention, and we all need to give each other space and grace in this, and get support when we need it. Yeah. Very helpful.
I do want to mention that there have been a lot of warm lines that have been set up, kind of like hotlines, but warm lines. So it's not traditional teletherapy, but they're just open phone numbers where there's volunteers and there's professionals there that can receive your phone call, and it's a place to vent. It's a place to find support. It doesn't have to be teletherapy in the traditional sense. It can really just be an ear to talk to. And those have been set up all throughout the world.
Yeah, where do we find that information, Alison? Because I've not heard of that until
Absolutely. And we have, I can send you some resources as well. But one that I found is for in the United States is from NAMI, which is, I believe, is at the National Association for Mental Illness. And they have set up some warm lines, as well as online support groups. There's various different ways that individuals and families can find support.
Thank Thank you. We'll be sure to share those resources with our audience. And of course, for people with narcolepsy, we do digital peer-to-peer support groups through the week, every week. So just jump onto our website at www.wakeupnarcolepsy.org. So I'd love to thank you both for your time today. And for all that you do in terms of research and also in the clinical space for people experiencing loss and grief and trauma. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
What a privilege. Thank you.